Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Medea. I'm the head of education programs here at the American Philosophical Society. I am delighted to welcome you all to the fourth day of the APS's virtual symposium, The Promise and Pitfalls of Citizen Science. I am glad that so many of you have joined us today and throughout the entire symposium, and hope you will continue to join us through tomorrow. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people. His historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. This week's conference is inspired by the Society's 2021 exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. It expands on the exhibition's themes by exploring understandings of citizen science over time, placing historical initiatives in conversation with present-day projects, as well as reflecting on the future needs and opportunities of the movement. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library, museum collections, and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry, you all have been muted, and that's okay, and that's intentional. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type your question in there at any time, and we'll be sure to check throughout the session, and we'll use those at the end. And again, there will be time at the end of the panel for you to submit questions throughout for our speaker. And we also encourage you to keep the conversation going on the APS's social media using the hashtag CitSciAPS. That's hashtag CITSCIAPS. Papers from today's speakers are available for download from the conference website and may be accessed using the passcode CitSci2021. Finally, we are excited to offer closed captioning for this conference. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It is to the right of the Q&A button. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Wertheimer, who will be presenting at our final showcase on Are We Alone in the Universe? Millions of Seti at Home volunteers search for ET. Dan Wertheimer was in the Homebrew Computer Club with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Everyone in that club became ultra rich except Dan. Now, Dan holds the Marilyn and Watson Alberts Seti Chair at UC Berkeley. He's chief scientist of the Berkeley Seti Research Center and principal investigator of Seti at Home and several radio and optical Seti programs. I believe I could go on and on about Dan's involvement in these fields, but I'll cut it short right there, and I'll just hop into the conversation and allow Dan to take it from here.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that kind introduction. Let's see, I want to share my PowerPoint. Hang on just a second. Okay. Can you guys see that? Is anybody out there, the title slide?
Yep, all good.
Great. Okay, so I want to talk to you about this question, are we alone? Is anybody out there? And how we used volunteers around the world to help us in this search for ET. First, before I get into the volunteer search, the SETI home search, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of SETI. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And 200 years ago, Gauss, the mathematician, suggested that we get in touch with ET by making a large geometric structure, a right triangle made of pine trees, 3, 4, 5 miles on a side, a big square of dirt, water, a big square of wheat, and ET would look down with their telescope and see that we knew about the Pythagorean theorem and perhaps get in touch with us. And then also a couple hundred years ago, von Littron suggested that we get in touch with ET by digging a large circular ditch 20 miles across and fill the ditch with kerosene and then use this match, not to scale, to make a bright circle of fire. And ET would see this bright circle of light on Earth with their telescope, and perhaps they would get in touch with us. And then also almost 200 years ago, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this little message. This was another idea of how we get in touch with the Martians. And the idea was to use large mirrors to reflect sunlight to the Martians, actually several mirrors, one in Paris and the others to outline the shape of the Big Dipper. And ET would see these bright lights on the planet and perhaps get in touch with us. Then in the 1961, Frank Drake used an equation to calculate the number of civilizations that are in the Milky Way galaxy. It's called the Drake equation. It's the theoretical approach. There's N on the left of the equation is the number of civilizations we can communicate. On the right are a bunch of parameters. The problem with this equation is that we don't know what any of these parameters are. So it's a way to take a kind of a big question, are we alone, and break it up into smaller questions, but we really don't know the answer to the smaller questions. The way the equation works is you start with like the number of stars in the galaxy, and then you say how many of those have planets, and then how many of those are good planets that have liquid water and the right conditions for life. And then the next thing is, well, if you have a good planet, how often do you get life? And then the next thing is, if you get life, how often do you get intelligence? And then the next thing is, if you have intelligent life, do you get communication technologies? Do they develop lasers or radio or some way we could communicate with them? And the last factor is, how long does this civilization live? As soon as they develop communication technologies, do they also develop nuclear and biological weapons? Do they blow themselves up? You know, our planet is 5 billion years old, but it's going to be around another couple of billion years. And some civilizations, some stars are 10 billion years old. So you can imagine very advanced civilizations out there if they figure out how to stop killing each other. Another thing that happened, this is in 1970, in the 70s, a way to communicate with ET. This is a plaque on the Pioneer 10 spacecraft sending pornography out into space. And they think that maybe a way to communicate with ET is pictures. So the Pioneer 10 spacecraft, here's a little picture of the solar system and the sun and Mercury, Venus and Earth. And here's the spacecraft going out. And here's a picture of the spacecraft with a couple of humans in front of it. And these are directions, a little map, so they can come, they'll know where we live and they can come eat us if they want. Now you might laugh at some of these early ideas, but we're wondering, those were the best ideas at the time. And so maybe the ideas that we have now are things that you're going to laugh at a couple hundred years ago. So it might be naive to think that we know how to best to search today, given this kind of history of different ideas over the years. Maybe we're kind of thinking anthropocentrically. Nevertheless, we think the best idea right now would be to kind of look for some kind of artifact of their technology. It's very hard to find primitive life, you know, and at a distant civilization. But we might, if they have technology, we might be able to detect some artifact of their technology. And one of the ideas is that Earthling sends off a lot of television and radio and radar signals out into space, not intentionally, but this is a plot of television power leaving the Earth. And you can see we started television in the 40s, and we've been doing that now for a long time. And the Earth is getting brighter and brighter, growing exponentially. And right now, the Earth is brighter than the sun at television frequencies. And the early shows that left the Earth, like I Love Lucy and Ed Sullivan, have been going out, and they've gone past about 10,000 stars. The nearby stars have seen The Simpsons. So maybe if other civilizations have something like TV or radio or radar signals, maybe we could detect those things. Earthlings have even sent messages intentionally out into space. This is very controversial, but nevertheless, a few people have done this. This was a picture that was sent and transmitted in radio waves, but you can change it back into a picture, and it's got the solar system and a human and DNA and a picture of the telescope, and it was sent to a globular cluster that's 25,000 light years away, so it'll take 25,000 years to get there and 25,000 years for them to send a message back and reach us. So I've got my alarm set for 50,000 years from now. So we've sent messages intentionally. We've sent a lot of messages accidentally, our television, radio, radar. So we could look for these things if they're out there. We could look for these artifacts of their technology, or maybe they have seen oxygen or atmosphere, or if they're nearby, they might have seen our television, and they might send us some deliberate thing. If they send us a deliberate message, it'll probably be easy to decode with lots of language lessons and pictures, and it might contain a lot of information, their whole Library of Congress, all their music, poetry, literature, science, medicine. They might get us on the galactic internet. We could learn about all the other civilizations that are out there. The civilizations might be billions of years ahead of us. We can't find the primitive ones. We can't find the ones that are still bacterias or plants. That's hard to do, but we might be able to do that in 100 years or so. At Berkeley, we've got about 20 people, a lot of students working on this. We have support from the Breakthrough Foundation, the National Science Foundation, NASA, individual donors help us out. We have a lot of support from the Seti home volunteers, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. And we have companies that donate stuff that we use, computers and chips we use. And we have different telescopes that we use around the world, the radio telescopes to look for radio signals, infrared and optical telescopes to look for laser signals. This was the first telescope that we used in Northern California. This is a radio telescope, 85 feet across. And while we were using it, this is what happened to that telescope. This is the dish. It used to be up on top of this pedestal. So we moved to this larger telescope in West Virginia. This one's 300 feet across. And while we were using this telescope to look for ET, this is what happened to that telescope. So then we moved to what used to be the world's largest telescope, the Arecibo Telescope, where we collected data for the SETI at Home project, the volunteer citizen science project, volunteer computing project. This telescope is 1,000 feet across. It holds 10 billion bowls of cornflakes. And while we're using this telescope to collect data for SETI at Home, this is what happened to the Arecibo Telescope in Puerto Rico. And here's a little movie of what happened in December of last year. So you can't see the dish down at the bottom, but you can see this structure up above the telescope. This thing weighs 700 tons, and the cables broke after 70 years. And that 710 structure came crashing down into the dish, and the towers collapsed. And that was the end of the Arecibo Telescope, where we collected data for SETI at Home. Now you might ask why this happening to Dan and all these SETI projects, and the answer, according to the World Weekly News, is that the aliens did not want to be discovered, zapped by hostile space aliens. One of the problems in SETI is that we don't know what frequency or what channel ET might be broadcasting on. And so this is different channels that we're listening to. Here's a strong signal. That's the kind of thing we're looking for, just something strong at some frequency, some channel. But we wanted to look at different kinds of things to get a little more sophisticated. This is an example of signals that are not on at a constant channel, but are changing in frequency. So instead of staying at a constant frequency, it would change in frequency. Like this one is going down in frequency. This one's going up in frequency. And so we want to look at those. That might happen because transmitters are on planets that are spinning around and moving around, and that causes a Doppler shift, and that causes an acceleration, and you get these signals that are changing in frequency. So you can find these patterns with your eye, but we have about 100 million of these things to look at every second, a lot of data, petabytes of data. The computers can do that too. We also want to look for pulsing signals, this kind of bip, 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 bip that you can see in this picture. But the reason you can see it in this picture is because I've circled the repeating pulses. It's actually hard if I remove these circles and I just say, can you find a repeating pattern in this scatter diagram of dots? It's actually hard for you to do, but the computers can do it, but it takes a lot of computing power to find this thing. And we have 100 million of these things to look at every second. So what we did in the SETI at Home project was we recorded the data from the Arecibo Telescope at the National Energy Supercomputing Center. We have a few petabytes of data there. And then at Berkeley, we break that data up into what we call work units, different chunks of the sky. Everybody gets 100 seconds of data from the Arecibo Telescope. And then we send it out to the public the volunteers that download the Seti at Home screensaver to analyze this data. And if you want to download the Seti at Home screensaver, you can't right now, we put it into hibernation last year, but it lasted for about 20 years. It's this free screensaver program that you download on your computer or on your cell phone or your laptop. And when you run it, well, it pops up just like any other screensaver. So when you go out for a cup of coffee, the Seti at Home screensaver pops up, and you get this little thing on your computer that shows you the work unit that you've been assigned, the part of the sky you're looking at, the coordinates, the frequency band that you've been assigned. It reminds you what your name is. It shows you the data it's working on, shows you interesting signals that it finds. And it might take a few days for your computer to analyze this data, depending on how often you go out for a cup of coffee. And then when it's done analyzing this piece of the sky, it sends the results of the analysis that you've been assigned over the internet back to our servers at Berkeley, and we record any interesting signals that you found along with your name. So if it turns out you are the lucky guy that finds ET, you might get the Nobel Prize, although you might have to share it with a lot of people. This is a little animation that shows you the data coming out from our university, going out around the world to the volunteers, and then when they're finished analyzing the data, they send the data back over the internet. About 8 million people have signed up for the Seti at Home project. They're spread out in 226 countries. They built one of the biggest supercomputers on the planet, beyond our kind of wildest dreams. It turned into the most sensitive search that's ever been done. And we can look for a much richer variety of signals thanks to the Seti at Home volunteers and all this computing time, donating 1,000 years of computing time every day. So if we just had one computer, it would take us 1,000 years to do what the volunteers do in one day. So we're really grateful to the Seti at Home participants to build such a powerful search. Individuals can, if they want, this is optional, but if they want, they can upload some information about themselves and make information about themselves public. I'm an artist living in San Francisco. I paint murals and trompe l'oeil and so on. You can also join teams. This is optional, but there are about 60,000 teams. There's primary school, junior colleges, university, high school teams, small, medium, large size companies. And the teams compete with each other in somewhat friendly ways. IBM here has donated 3,000 years of computing time. I wish I could say that the thing that really drove people to Seti at Home was this idea of participating in a really important question: are we alone? But a lot of the motivation was, my computer's faster than you, my team has done more work than yours. A lot of the pages in Seti at Home that were the most popular were what we call the stats pages, the statistics, how much work you've done, or your computer's done, or your team has done. People have even gone to kind of extreme behaviors where this guy has built a whole rack of computers. It's called a Seti farm, to rack up the work units, to process a lot of data. So his name would get up near the top of the website as one of the top contributors to the Seti at Home project. And he's posing here. You can go to this website, setifarm.org, and you can see a lot of these people. This person is posing next to his farm of Seti at Home servers with bolt cutters. I'm not sure why. If you don't want to build a big thing, you can buy work units on eBay. So this guy is selling his 7,000 credits, that Seti at Home work units. He says, if you buy this thing on eBay, a unique choice, he'll transfer his work units to your account, and you'll join the elite top 0.18% of all Seti at Home users. This went for $275. Well, we haven't found ET yet, but since we haven't found ET, I'm just going to brag a little bit about the spin-offs. One spin-off is that there were a lot of people that formed these Seti at Home clubs, where people would get together and talk about this question: are we alone? And how to participate. And people made all kinds of contributions. They helped us write the code. It's big open source software. They composed music and poetry and literature and did a lot of things. They sent money. Anyway, at these Seti at Home clubs, a lot of people met. Some marriages happened. Some kids happened out of this thing. I guess I'm indirectly responsible for some of the humans on this planet. Another spin-off was that we developed some curriculum for kids in middle schools as they participated with their computers at school or at home or their cell phones. This question, are we alone, touches on a lot of different topics. It's a great opportunity to get kids engaged in science. The SETI question touches on evolution and astronomy and physics and chemistry, and also social questions about how long civilizations live and how can we make our civilization and the environment last a long time. So it's a great kind of hook for getting kids interested in science and the social sciences. We also developed, some of you may be familiar with this open source infrastructure to participate in a lot of different science projects. It's called BOINC, and it's Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing, led by David Anderson. And it's an infrastructure for volunteer computing or distributed computing, or we call it edge resource aggregation. And the idea is that you can not just participate in SETI, but you can participate in dozens of different projects that you can sign up for. There are astronomy projects, there's environmental projects, there's a lot of biology projects. You can look for malaria drugs or cancer drugs. You can look for COVID-19 therapeutics. You can do global warming research, and you can pick your favorite projects, and you can allocate 30% of your spare computing cycles for SETI and 20% for malaria drugs. Pick your favorite projects. This is SETI at home. This is global warming climate prediction. This is gravitational waves. This is primordial black holes. This is the COVID-19 therapeutic search. Another project that we did is more a citizens project, science project. It's not just using your computer or your cell phone, but using your eyes and your brain to help out. We launched this spacecraft called Stardust, and what Stardust was to scoop up. It flew through the tail of a comet, and it was a sample return mission. It brought back particles from the tail of the comet so we could learn what the comet was made of. It also went way out into the solar system to scoop up some of the primordial dust that was around 5 billion years ago when the planets were forming. We're still trying to figure out how the planets formed, and we wanted to scoop up some of this dust and see what it was made of and how the dust locks together to form bigger particles. So we brought these samples back into our lab at Berkeley in this aerogel foam, and these little microscopic particles are in that foam somewhere, but they're really hard to find. It would take hundreds or maybe even thousands of students looking for dozens of years to find the little dust particles. So what we did is we asked the public for help. We put it on this automated microscope that scans and makes millions and millions of what we call focus movies, images, and you can download the Stardust at Home project, where you run a virtual microscope. You take a little training course, you learn how to recognize these dust particles. We had about 70,000 volunteers that learned how to, and they found particles we never would have found, including things that made up the original dust that when the planets were forming, that helps us understand kind of what was happening in the early universe. And if you find one of those particles, which are very rare, you get your name on a Nature paper, which is a big deal in science. So the projects we've done in our research group are these volunteer computing projects, SETI at Home and Astropulse, looking for primordial black holes, the BOINC project. We've done a few citizen science projects with Stardust, and recently a project called Energy at Home, which we're just getting started on, where we're asking students, middle, high school, to go and do an energy audit of their home. They use a little power meter to measure how much power their TV pulls or their refrigerator pulls. Some TVs are 100 watts when they're off. Some TVs are 1 watt when they're off, and then they can compare the amount of electricity and what things are using a lot of electricity in their home with other kids, and see what's a good way to be efficient in the home. Other spin-offs that have come from SETI are the instruments that we originally developed for SETI are used by the astronomy community to do all kinds of astronomy research. They made the first images of a black hole. They discovered fast radio bursts. They discovered a lot of pulsars. They discovered a planet made out of solid diamond. The instruments are used not just in astronomy, but a little bit in medical research for reading out data from a brain. We put electrodes in there, 256 little electrodes, and then we use some of the SETI instrumentation to get a wireless link to get the data out. We hope eventually that can be used to control a prosthetic arm. A big spinoff is we've had about 100 students go through there. They've done all kinds of really cool stuff, not just SETI, when they graduate. I want to say a little bit about where Earthlings are going and possible future experiments that we're working on and what might happen in the next 100 or 1,000 years, or perhaps in our lifetime. So when the Arecibo Telescope collapsed, we started using this FAST telescope in China. This is even bigger. It's now the world's biggest telescope. It's 500 meters across. And there, we may eventually record data there for a kind of SETI at Home project, this SETI at Home 2. Another thing we're working on with colleagues around the world is how to build a big telescope out of lots of little telescopes. This thing doesn't exist yet, but there's a prototype of it in South Africa with 64 dishes, but we hope to build it out. It's called the Square Kilometer, a big international project with perhaps thousands of dishes combined to make a really big telescope that we can use for SETI. We're also starting to look for laser signals. And we have a new project called PanoSETI, which we want to have look all over the sky at once with telescopes poking out of a dome. This is an artist's conception. We don't have that yet, but we have 2 telescopes now at Laboratory, just a little bit south of where I live, that are starting to do this survey, and we're starting to learn how to do this. And we hope to build that out. If anybody wants to write us a check, we'll build a big thing with 100 telescopes. And PanoSETI, this thing looking for laser signals that are like flashes of light, is exploring a whole new parameter space, a new thing that nobody's looked at before. We're looking for flashes that are 1/1000th of a second long, or 1/100000th of a second long, or maybe 1,000th of a second. Nobody's really done that before. And there's this really interesting thing in nature that we don't understand, but when you look at some new search space that look at some place that nobody's looked before, you find stuff. And we don't understand why nature has phenomena and frequencies and energies, but if you look at some new wavelength or new frequency that nobody's looked at before, there's usually something there. And so maybe we'll not find ET, but we'll maybe find something interesting. Well, I'm optimistic in the long run that Earthlings might be able to find other civilizations. If they're now, we're an emerging civilization. We're just getting in the game. We're just learning how we might communicate or learn about other civilizations if they're out there. But the technology is changing very quickly thanks to Moore's law. This is telescopes getting better and better, doubling every 4 years. We used to listen to 100 channels. Now we listen to 100 billion channels. Computing power, of course, is growing exponential. Right now, computers are as smart as a lizard or guppy, but if this trend continues, computers in 20 or 30 years will be as smart as humans, which could be quite good for SETI, but maybe not so good for our civilization, depending on if we learn to use them well. This is a thing that might be 100 years from now. The idea is, could we launch a spacecraft out to the nearest star and get there near the speed of light? Our spacecraft right now are really slow. It would take 100,000 years to get to the nearest star. But this thing is a very lightweight spacecraft. It only weighs 1 gram. It's a sail that's 4 meters across. It doesn't have an engine built into the spacecraft, but you shine this 50 gigawatt laser on it from the ground, and it pushes on the sail. And after 2 minutes, it's going up at 20% the speed of light. And then it would coast for 20 years to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, maybe take a picture and send something. Breakthrough star shot. That's maybe 100 years away. Maybe even more than 100 years away is this idea of using the sun as a giant telescope the size of a sun. The sun bends light, Einstein showed that, and you can use it as a lens or like a, but the problem is the focus of that lens is way out beyond Pluto and it's moving around. We don't really know how to put a camera out there now, but if you could do that, you get incredibly good resolution. You know, you could see vehicles, almost read license plates on an extrasolar planet. Don't hold your breath on that. But a couple of my favorite quotes. Phil Morrison said that SETI is the archaeology of the future. And what he meant by that is that if we ever do get in touch with ET, it's likely they're going to be 1 billion years ahead of us. and we can learn what's in our future. How did they get through their bottleneck when they were killing each other and they had these weapons pointed at each other? So we could learn a lot. Carl Sagan said that SETI is profound either way. And I think what he meant by that was that we could get on the galactic internet and learn a lot and learn about what's in our future and perhaps how to prevent bad things that might have happened to their civilization or other civilizations. But also it's profound the other way. What if we did a big thorough search, even though we can't really do a thorough comprehensive search right now, maybe in 100 years from now, Earthlings will be able to do a thorough search and kind of, hey, we haven't found anything. And that means that life is incredibly precious. There's not, there is other civilizations are incredible of life on our planet. Actually, we should probably do that either way. If you've been asleep, this is a kind of summary slide, no ET so far. We're still working on it, but it's not my last slide. I wanted to end with a couple of haikus. So that the SETI at Home volunteers have helped us in lots of different ways. I mentioned they've composed music and poetry, and they've composed literature, and they send donations to keep the students going. And of course, they built an incredibly powerful computer that's made the most sensitive search on the planet. Some people have sent in haikus, and thousands of haikus. You can read them all on the website, but I'm just going to read you a couple of them. Paula Cook said, "Searching for life, answers are revealed about ourselves." And this is my last slide. Dan Seidner, 1 million Earthlings bounded by optimism leave their PCs on. So thank you very much. And Mike, thanks for moderating, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments from the audience. And Adriana, thank you so much for bringing us all together. You've done a huge amount of work organizing this conference.
Thank you so much, Dan. My brain is spinning, even from the haikus and down to the line of profound either way. I don't know if my questions will be profound either way, but I'll try to make them somewhat profound anyway. And if you do have questions, please remember to submit those through the Q&A. I'll be checking in there and trying to pull together some common strands from that. But I want to start on, there is such a clear thread too, and I think this might be common across studies of extraterrestrial life, of humor and kind of pop culture references and being able to connect on a very kind of human level that sometimes science, especially when you think about astrophysics, might miss. Do you find that that's helpful and essential in being able to explain the hard science behind what SETI does and being able to draw people in for a citizen science project?
Yeah, I think, we were not the first people to do distributed computing. There were projects before us but they were much harder to kind of wrap your head around if you're not a nerd. The Mersenne prime project number was looking for a special kind of prime number, and it was also harder to use. You had to be a Linux guru to run it. I think SETI is a question that immediately people grasp. I think actually all of astronomy is very kind of visual and kind of easy to understand. You just look up at the sky and I think people were asking this question, are we alone, hundreds of thousands of years ago? And so I think little kids, it's easy to talk about astronomy, and especially SETI, I think is a easy thing. And I think that's probably why we were so successful. I mean, we did make it easy to run the screensaver, and it worked on a lot of different computers, and it's just easy to install and use. And but I think mostly it's just kind of a cool thing that people are excited about.
Yeah, definitely. Because it is just so cool. You can't get away from the cool factor in these projects. But you mentioned people participating in this, and a wide variety of people participating in it. And there are both active and kind of passive volunteer roles in SETI and the projects going on. Have you been able to kind of get a sense of barriers in participation, or who's participating and who isn't in these projects?
Well, we don't collect demographics. People can optionally tell us what country they live in. They can tell us a little bit of information about themselves. But I think we have not done a very good job of bringing in kind of underrepresented communities. First of all, in these, this is obvious, but you know, you need to have a computer or a cell phone, and you have to have a good internet connection, and you have to be somewhat savvy technologically. And so that automatically means that we're, you know, mostly reaching, you know, white nerds. On the other hand, I think a lot of kids were running it in elementary schools, and there are good examples of underrepresented populations getting involved. I know a lot of women, a lot of young girls ran this thing at schools. I spent a lot of time going out to elementary schools and middle schools and high schools and talking about this stuff. And I would say that kind of my field is it's not very good at the top. So you know, there are a lot of women that are interested in science in the early years, and we are, even in graduate school, we have half women. But as you go up, the faculty are, you know, it's okay at the early levels, you know, at the assistant, associate, but as you go up to the really senior faculty, we have fewer and fewer women. And that's a problem that I'm hoping it's getting better though. I'm optimistic in the long run.
Yeah, it's so common across multiple fields, especially the ones that we're talking about with this symposium. And it's good to think about the change over time with these things. And speaking of time, I always like to try to find a good segue for these. Time is such a big factor in this, from the possible time delays, billions of years, light years, like talking about like both space and distance and time. Is human interest in communicating with ET like a constant? Do you think it changes over time?
You know, the closest star to us, Proxima Centauri, is 4 light years away. So at the speed of light, at the speed of radio or television or lasers or something like that, it's 4 years to get a message there, 4 years for them to reply. And it's very unlikely that life is so prevalent. I'm optimistic about life, and, you know, it'd be bizarre if we're alone in the universe and there's 1 trillion planets in the Milky Way galaxy. And even though my optimism, I think the nearest intelligent civilization is much further away, maybe 100 or 1,000 light years away. So it's not an 8-year round trip. It might be a 200-year round trip, or, you know, even longer to get. So it's not the kind of communication between individuals. It's not like, hi, how's your mom? How's your family doing? Nice to talk. It's really a communication between civilizations. You know, it's more like, you know, here's our Library of Congress. Here's all about information about our civilization. And there are examples of that kind of long time communication already. You know, when you can't talk back to Shakespeare or the people that wrote the classic, you know, the Greek Homer. I think, but, you know, those come from thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, but they're still interesting communications. But those are one-way communication. But you don't get a response maybe in your lifetime. And I think we need to start thinking about these long timescales instead of just sort of corporate quarterly profits. I'm really keen on the Long Now Foundation, which is starting to get us thinking about 1,000 or million-year timescales. And Seti kind of helps that. I think astronomy helps give us that perspective.
Yeah, it makes this sense of hope in the long term, in the extreme long term, very tangible in like a scientific but helpful way, if that makes any sense. So you mentioned if somebody left their computer on and their screensaver was the one to detect any number of things, right? How do you report that in both to the person whose computer was able to make the discovery, but then how do you also go about, like, what's your regular communication structure with the public and with the scientific community?
Right, so we found that the Seti at Home participants are just clamoring for information. They love it when we post a little blog, you know, and we unfortunately didn't do enough of that to tell them, you know, what's going on with the status of the project, you know, what are the best signals we've found so far, what are we looking at? I wish, but those were very well read. I think, you know, people are clamoring for information. So you get some feedback. So even with our postings, you know, we did have newsletters and updates and things like that. We had this thing called, what would you call, the forums, where people could help each other. You know, my thing is broken. How do I, you know, I can't get my thing to work. There were a lot of people helping each other, which is great because we didn't have the person power to help, you know, if you had a little problem. And there was a lot of really goodwill. on the forums, there was a lot of discussion, kind of scientific questions, how does life get started? What kind of technology they might have if they're a billion years ahead of us? There was a lot of kind of interesting speculation, and people would talk about all kinds of things. We had to have kind of self-moderated because we had, I think, maybe at one point, hundreds of thousands of people using the forums. That was an optional thing. And people are still doing that.
Especially with an open communication system like a forum too, I imagine that there are, even with the systems in place to do the SETI observations and contributions, I imagine there's a number of off-topic things either that are just like discoveries that weren't intentional necessarily, and then just questions in the forum that aren't necessarily relevant to what SETI's
so the forums branched off into all kinds of wild and kinky stuff. And we tried to sort of have rules to sort of confine it. And certainly we did have rules to sort of make sure that people were not, doing kind of the hate stuff. And luckily, almost all of it was quite good. There were a few things that we, had to get in the way and say, we had to stop a few people from posting, but we didn't have this problem like Facebook has, where they promote the most vitriolic stuff to the top because it makes them the most money. So I think people were generally pretty good.
It's a wonderful thing to hear. Thank goodness. So especially throughout the conference or the symposium, and I think today in particular, there's a good sense of nationalism in some of these projects. Do you find that there is a kind of nationalist, or more so internationalist, or intergalactic in this case, spin and feel to these projects?
Yeah, I hope you're right. I think that this question, are we alone, and bringing people together from a lot of different countries working together on a kind of a global science project, is a kind of way to kind of promote kind of thinking beyond kind of nationalist boundaries. And I think for a long time, science has been good. We work together with a lot of traditionally all kinds of science. And I think this is true not just in science, but probably in a lot of different disciplines. They're very international. So, professionals are working together all over the world. But I think in general, astronomy has been doing that for a long time. I work with people in all different kinds of countries. And that is just a useful thing. Even if our governments are not collaborating very well, it's nice to have, at least in my world, in the scientific world, a lot of international collaboration. That can be very useful to help bring the countries together.
Right, and especially, I always love thinking about that in reference to the APS too, where science is meant to kind of go above internationally drawn boundaries in a way that makes sense for the production of knowledge. And thinking about where these research centers are located, are there certain reasons why a telescope might be in West Virginia or Puerto Rico? What are those decision-making factors?
So it turns out there's a big problem when you do SETI. You're looking for radio signals from ET, but what we find are signals from terrestrials. So there's this big problem with radio pollution, and it's getting worse and worse. That more and more TV transmitters, cell phone towers, radar everywhere, and the planet is covered with this stuff. And some bands we can't just work in, in the television bands. And if ET was broadcasting in one of the TV bands, we just wouldn't know because we just can't listen there. So you want to put these radio telescopes away from people and their transmitters. And so in West Virginia, there's this thing called the radio quiet zone, where if you bring your cell phone there, it won't work because there are no cell phone towers, which is kind of nice, actually.
Yeah, beautiful, yeah.
In Puerto Rico, where the Arecibo Telescope used to be a very radio quiet place, luckily it's in a big valley, and the mountains kind of protect the radio waves from getting in, but still the satellites fly over, and it's getting harder and harder to do SETI on our planet. We may eventually have to go to the backside of the moon, where the moon would act like a big shield, so from all the radio pollution that we give off. And that'll be very expensive to put a telescope on the backside of the moon. That's, I don't know, tens of billions of dollars. So this may be a kind of unique window where we can still look for ET relatively inexpensively on this planet.
Yeah, because the chart that you showed about the radio waves being emitted from the planet, it's way more than logarithmic and exponential. It's ridiculous to see that spike increase like that. But I do hope that there are extraterrestrials watching I Love Lucy and laughing out there. So with communication and these and all of this work, who gets to decide what is communicated? Like you mentioned, the one illustration was somewhat controversial. So
that is it's a great question. Who should speak for Earth? You know, like, so the messages that have been sent out so far, which is quite controversial. So there are a lot of messages that are leaking off the planet accidentally, all the television, radio, radar, everything, you know, that goes out into space. But then there are these things that have been deliberately transmitted, usually by small groups of people. You know, anybody with a transmitter can do it. There's not much regulation. There's certainly no global international regulation how to do this. And so my thinking on this is that we should not be deliberately transmitting messages into space. We don't know what's out there. Other civilizations, we'd like to think they're peaceful and want to help us out, the advanced civilizations, but maybe that's not true. Maybe we have something useful. Maybe they're going to come and mine our planet and grind it up to get all the thorium out or something. So I suspect advanced civilizations are not dangerous, but I don't know that for sure. So I think that it's too risky to do this kind of stuff that puts, 7 billion Earthlings at risk just because you think it's pretty safe to transmit messages out there. And so I think because we're an emerging civilization, we should just be listening at first to learn more about the universe. We're just getting started in this, and we know very little about the universe or what's out there or what other civilizations might be out there and whether they're good or bad. And so I think we should just be trying to learn more about our situation at first, before, and not do any transmission.
There's something really powerful about that idea of waiting and listening and thinking about the communication that goes out and connecting it to citizen science projects like this, where it's participatory to a certain degree, but then the kind of like ultimate diplomatic goals and the other kind of larger goals are left to the organization doing the citizen science projects, which is, there's something fun in that idea and thinking about how those structures kind of protect the civilians or the communities doing these projects, even in relation to something as grandiose as extraterrestrial communication. And you mentioned in this way too that a lot of this work in a very profound way connects to so many other disciplines, like humanities, just asking the question, how do we communicate with extraterrestrial life? And citizen science connects so closely with science communication that, do you think there's a power in citizen science projects like this and the questions that you're asking that can't always be found in just the hard sciences alone, that this brings in that element of having to communicate across interdisciplinary boundaries?
Well, certainly SETI is interdisciplinary. We have all kinds of people coming, thinking about how we're going to communicate with ET, what their civilization, whether they're going to be, violent. There's all kinds of stuff outside of science, that the social sciences, the psychologists, does you get convergent evolution? Are advanced civilizations going to be good to us and to other civilizations? These are big questions that are outside kind of the realm of the physical sciences, but these are important questions that we need to touch on. And then sort of the other kind of interdisciplinary axis are things in the physics, like how does life get started, about the chemistry, about the biology, and evolution and things like that. So it's a very interdisciplinary field. And it's a lot of fun because I've learned a lot about all kinds of stuff.
It's amazing how much you have to know to even think about those concepts too, that you wouldn't think that you would have to know about the history of human evolution to think about the history of astrobiological evolution as well. And there's something about motivation in all of this that where if it's either a passive citizen science project, like you download the thing and it's a screensaver, or if you're using I think it was the Stardust, the microscope for that, where it's more active of situation, have you found that you're able to sense motivations in wanting to join a citizen science project or community science project via the work that you've done at Seti?
I'm not directly involved with the Stardust at Home project, and I'm not really an expert on these citizen science projects. Most of the work that I've done is in these volunteer computing things like Seti at Home and AstroPulse at Home, and my students did write the software for Stardust at Home, but I'm not the principal scientist that engages the public on that. But my sense is that the ones where you're directly involved, rather than just loaning your spare computing cycles or your cell phone, to a project, those are much more engaging. And I think that those people are generally learning more and feeling much more like they're participating. But even so, I think there were a lot of people in Seti at Home who got really engaged and did all kinds of things to help our project out. And I think certainly a lot of kids, a lot of retired people. And it did make them feel really part of a community, even if they weren't, working on the project day to day. I think it was a useful kind of community building project.
Yeah, which is great to think about in the context of community sciences and science, where you are contributing to a larger body of sorts of both knowledge, but also community. And something to go back to as we wind this down. I think it was the Drake equation. You mentioned that it's this beautiful idea of being able to take such a large question, not deal with that question itself really, and then try to answer a bunch of smaller questions in relation to that. What is Seti's role in answering any of the small questions, or what small questions is Seti answering to contribute to this? Yeah.
Okay, so that equation was kind of a whittling down process. So you say, okay, how many stars are there? And you say, well, how many of those stars have planets, and how many of those planets are good planets with the right chemicals and the right temperatures for life to get started? And then the next thing is like, well, if you got one of those, how often does life actually get started? And then, primitive life, single-celled things. And then the next whittling down thing is, well, you got single-celled things. How often do you get intelligent creatures? And then do they develop communication? And then it keeps going and whittling down. And each one of those questions is fascinating all by itself, and there's like all kinds of people thinking about each one of those questions. But SETI kind of just goes around all of that stuff and just tries to answer it all in one swoop, like just go look. And, if we find intelligent creatures, then we'll kind of know the answer. If we find their technology, but we won't really know exactly how many civilizations are out there. But we don't really need to answer all those questions about planets and life and evolution and intelligence. We can just go look. And I think actually, Frank Drake, he actually did go look, and when he wrote down that equation, he didn't mean that we would actually go and solve it and that would be the answer to he actually meant it as a way to start thinking about the problem. And he was organizing a conference about life in the universe. And he thought, in order to just organize our thinking, let's break the conference up into these different factors, and let's talk about planets, and let's talk about, intelligence. And it was a way to just organize our thoughts.
Which is always just helpful in science education, to break things up by questions or like topics like that, and then be able to go at them. But they're all connected in like a link of sorts or a series, which is just so good to have in tow. I find it fascinating usually that, and this is just a goofy question, I think, anyway, but in a fun sense, that whenever it's talked about if extraterrestrial communication makes its way back to Earth, that form of extraterrestrial life will have a connection to other civilizations outside of Earth, that there's like a gateway of sorts that once you connect with one, you can connect to multiple others. Is there meaning behind that, or is it just the kind of factors of time, lag, location, things like that?
So this is about, is there a galactic internet out there?
Yeah.
Are all the civilizations talking to each other? We're just not on the network because we're just primitive, we're just getting in the game. We just discovered radio a mere 100 years ago, and maybe they're all using something even better that we don't know about, tachyons or subspace communication or something like that. Yeah, I think that, in evolution, there's different ways to succeed. You can be fast or have a hard shell, but one way to succeed in certain evolutionary niches is to be intelligent and be curious about the world. And that's going to happen on a lot of different places, not every place. But I think those kind of civilizations that are curious are going to want to, we're curious about, is there life out there? And they're going to want to get in touch and find out. So I think maybe not all civilizations are going to get on the galactic internet, but I think it's sort of inevitable.
I do. I love the point about being curious in the future and knowing and having that innate kind of ability to ask those questions or participate in asking those questions, or finding those answers. So I'll leave you with one last question. I think in the middle portion of your presentation, you mentioned that sometimes these methods of trying to communicate are 15 years later, 100 years later, viewed as being naive in some way. And at the end of your presentation, you mentioned where the future of this might go. So where do you see the questions shifting, or the communications really shifting in the next years, decades, eons?
Right. So I think one of the problems is that our thinking is likely to be anthropocentric. We just, we invent radio and we say, oh, ET is going to use radio. And then when we invented lasers, we say, oh, maybe ET will use lasers. So maybe in 100 years, we'll invent something even better than, electromagnetic communication. I don't know, faster than light, tachyons or something that we have no idea. But we know there's a lot of physics and astronomy that we have no idea about. So it would be naive to think, 95% of the universe, this dark energy, we have no idea what that is. We don't know what the dark matter is. There's big questions about how the universe got started. So we know there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand. So, there could be some new revolution in physics that allows us to communicate at something besides electromagnetic communication. But I think just even with the physics that we have now, there's so much stuff we could do in our lifetimes in the next 100 years, and the searches are going to get better and better. And we might get lucky; it could happen in our lifetimes. And you got to do what you know how to do. If you told Christopher Columbus, just you're wasting your time with these ships. Just wait 500 years; there'll be much better technology, airplanes, and it'd be a lot easier. But Columbus found something interesting, so maybe we will too.
It's so fantastic. And where do you think, I know so that was the last question, but it's a spin-off on that. And where do you think these participatory community or citizen science projects fit within that trajectory and that thinking?
So, most of the computing power is in the stuff that you and I own. It's at the edges of the internet. It's not these big supercomputers and these big things that are companies and governments use. Most of the computing power is in private hands. And so I think there are a lot of things you could do with that. And it turns out a lot of projects, I was surprised at this, can be distributed. And you can break a project up into lots of different pieces. And so I'm kind of optimistic that more and more people will participate in these things, and we can use them for good projects. It's sort of the democratization of scientific supercomputing, where people kind of vote which projects they're interested in. And, if you're interested in climate change, and you can work on that. So I think there's a big promise to kind of use all this spare computing cycle, use your cell phone at night when it's charging up, and solve some of these interesting scientific projects.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. I promise that was actually my last question. I think I hit all the questions in the Q&A as well.
Oh, great.
So thanks, you all, Mike, for joining. And thank you again, Dan, for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you for those great questions, audience. I can't see you, but I really appreciate your participating and great questions.